When we imagine a medieval wedding, we might picture knights in shining armor, ladies in flowing gowns, and the grand halls of castles lit by flickering candlelight. Yet, behind the romance we so often associate with the Middle Ages, there were customs and traditions surrounding marriage that were anything but romantic. Weddings in medieval Europe were less about personal choice and love, and more about alliances, power, and property. Families negotiated unions the way merchants might haggle over goods, and couples found themselves participating in ceremonies that today seem, at best, unusual, and at worst, uncomfortably awkward. From bizarre tests of fertility to contracts written long before the bride and groom had even met, medieval weddings were shaped by a world deeply concerned with lineage, land, and survival. Yet they were also moments of joy, pageantry, and celebration for the communities who attended. The paradox of these weddings lies in their mixture of the sacred and the strange, the festive and the formal, the heartfelt and the highly practical. In this exploration, we will step gently into the past and uncover the most awkward medieval wedding traditions you probably didn't know about. Some of these will make you smile, some may leave you astonished, and others might make you grateful to live in a different time. Let's begin. Section 1. Marriages Arranged in Childhood. One of the most strikingly awkward traditions of medieval Europe was the practice of arranging marriages when the bride and groom were still children. In fact, it was not uncommon for alliances to be decided when the prospective couple had barely learned to walk, let alone to think about love or partnership. In noble families, marriage was one of the most powerful tools of diplomacy. It was less about two individuals joining their lives, and more about families securing wealth, property, and political advantage. Imagine, for instance, a noble child of 5 years old, already being promised to another child across the continent. To us, it may seem unthinkable, but in the Middle Ages, it was a matter of practicality. Families wanted to ensure that their lands and titles would be protected and expanded. And arranging these contracts early prevented rivals from stepping in with their own proposals. In many cases, the children themselves had no say in the matter at all. The wedding itself, however, would not always take place during childhood. The church often preferred for marriages to be consummated only after the bride and groom had reached a more suitable age, though the definition of suitable was much different than today. For girls, it was often considered acceptable to marry once they reached puberty, which in medieval terms meant around 12 or 13 years old. Boys were often married somewhat later, in their mid to late teens. The awkwardness of such unions cannot be overstated. A bride might meet her husband for the very first time on the day of their wedding. She may have traveled across kingdoms, leaving behind her family, her home, and everything familiar to her. In some cases, the children who had been betrothed years earlier discovered they had grown into very different people, with personalities and expectations that did not align. Yet, the union was binding, because marriage in medieval Europe was as much a legal and financial contract as it was a spiritual one. Another layer of strangeness was added by the fact that many of these child marriages were sealed with elaborate public ceremonies that looked much like weddings themselves. A toddler bride might be dressed in fine clothes and paraded before her future husband's court, her hand placed ceremoniously in his as a symbol of the alliance. While consummation would not take place until later, the image of children performing roles far beyond their years was a common, and to our eyes, unsettling aspect of medieval marriage culture. The awkwardness also extended into the daily lives of these young couples once they were officially wed. A teenage girl might be expected to immediately take on the role of managing a household, supervising servants, and producing heirs. This immense responsibility, placed upon someone who was barely beyond childhood herself, was daunting. In some cases, older women of the household, mothers-in-law, aunts, or trusted advisors stepped in to guide the young bride. But this guidance often came with pressure to prove her fertility as quickly as possible. Since producing heirs was considered her primary duty, interestingly, not all arranged marriages were unhappy. Letters and chronicles tell us of couples who grew to care for one another deeply, even if their marriage had begun as nothing more than a signed contract between families. Some learned to work as a team, building their households and navigating court politics together. Yet, the circumstances under which these marriages began remain some of the most awkward traditions of the medieval period, proof that the path to matrimony was rarely guided by love alone. Childhood betrothals remind us that the medieval understanding of marriage was profoundly different from our own. Where we think of weddings as the culmination of romance, medieval families saw them as instruments of strategy, survival, and power. And in that difference lies one of the most fascinating and, yes, awkward truths of the Middle Ages. Section 2. The Bizarre Bedding Ceremony. If you thought arranged childhood marriages were uncomfortable, what came next, in many medieval weddings, may strike you as even more awkward. The bedding ceremony. Today, we might think of the wedding night as a private moment, one in which the newlyweds retreat behind closed doors to begin their life together. But in medieval Europe, privacy was not always guaranteed, especially when the legitimacy of heirs, the continuation of family lines, and the forging of alliances were at stake. The bedding ceremony was a practice in which the bride and groom were escorted to their marital bed by members of their families, their guests, or in some cases, by the entire wedding party. Imagine the scene. After hours of feasting, dancing, and celebrating, the young couple was paraded to their chamber, often amid music, laughter, and loud cheers. Their clothing might be ceremonially removed, not always fully, but enough to leave no doubt that the marriage was about to be consummated. The witnesses then ensured that the couple was settled into bed together, sometimes even waiting nearby or returning later to confirm that the act had taken place. Why would anyone put themselves through such an awkward ritual? The answer lies in the importance of lineage and legitimacy. In the Middle Ages, marriages among nobles and royals were not simply personal affairs. They were contracts upon which entire dynasties depended. A nobleman's estate, titles, and wealth would pass to his heirs, and those heirs needed to be indisputably his. The bedding ceremony, then, acted as a form of public guarantee. The marriage was real, binding, and consummated. Without this assurance, disputes over inheritance could arise, and rival claims could threaten the stability of families and kingdoms alike. In some places, the ceremony was relatively restrained. Guests would escort the couple with torches, sing songs, and perhaps sprinkle the bed with symbolic items, herbs for fertility, coins for prosperity, or even small tokens meant to ward off evil spirits. Once the couple was in bed, the door would be closed, and privacy at last restored. But in other cases, the ritual became far more invasive. Chronicles tell of wedding guests staying in the room, drinking, joking, and even tossing shoes or stockings at the couple while they lay in bed. The fun was meant to be light-hearted, but for the bride and groom, it must often have been unbearably awkward. Among the nobility, the ritual could take on an even more official tone. In France and parts of Germany, it was sometimes customary for high-ranking members of the court to remain in the room until they were satisfied that the union had been consummated. In England, the ritual was occasionally less intrusive, but still public enough that it was remembered by onlookers for years afterward. Imagine the pressure of knowing that your wedding night was not entirely your own, but instead a matter of public record, witnessed and reported like an event of state. The bedding ceremony also reflected deeper medieval attitudes toward marriage itself. Unlike today's view, which emphasizes personal love and mutual commitment, medieval society viewed marriage through the lens of duty, family obligation, and community interest. A wedding was not a private milestone. It was a public one, in which families, neighbors, and sometimes entire villages felt invested. The bedding ceremony, strange as it seems to us, was simply another way of making the private act of union visible to the community, a shared assurance that the marriage had been properly begun. What makes this tradition even more curious is the role of humor in the proceedings. Medieval people often used bawdy jokes, playful songs, and ribald humor to cope with the inherent awkwardness of the situation. Guests might sing verses, poking fun at the bride's innocence or the groom's supposed inexperience. They might make loud noises outside the chamber, or even pound on the walls in mock encouragement. Laughter, in this sense, was a way of easing the tension, but one suspects it did little to make the newlyweds feel at ease. Of course, not every bedding ceremony went according to plan. There are records of grooms fainting from nerves, brides resisting the public nature of the ritual, or even guests growing too rowdy and disruptive. In some cases, clerics or elders had to step in to remind the crowd that the ceremony, though playful, was also sacred. The thin line between solemn duty and public spectacle was often difficult to maintain. Over time, the bedding ceremony began to fade in many places, especially as notions of privacy and modesty shifted in later centuries. By the Renaissance, it was more common for the ritual to be symbolic rather than literal. Guests might escort the couple to their chamber with torches, but then leave them in peace. The essential purpose, ensuring the validity of the marriage, remained, but it no longer required such uncomfortable levels of scrutiny. Still, the tradition leaves us with a fascinating glimpse into the world of medieval weddings. For people of the Middle Ages, marriage was not simply about two individuals. It was about families, property, and communities. What we might see as an awkward intrusion into intimacy, they saw as a necessary ritual to protect the future. Today we might shake our heads at the thought of friends and relatives crowding into a honeymoon suite. But for medieval people, the bedding ceremony was simply part of the natural order of things. It was awkward, yes, but it was also a moment that symbolized trust, continuity, and the shared hopes of all who witnessed it. And so, as we imagine the flickering torches, the laughter, the music, and the nervous glances exchanged between bride and groom, we are reminded of how different, and yet how deeply human, medieval life could be. Section 3. Dowries, Wealth, and Awkward Transactions. When we think of weddings today, we often picture love, romance, and vows whispered under an arch of flowers. But in the Middle Ages, marriage was far less about love and far more about business. Few aspects of this are as telling or as awkward as the custom of dowries. To us, a dowry might seem like an outdated, strange concept, but for medieval families, it was at the heart of nearly every marriage negotiation. And the way it played out was often far from romantic. At its simplest, a dowry was a transfer of wealth or property from the bride's family to the groom or his household. This could include money, land, livestock, clothing, or even servants. The idea was that the bride brought resources with her to help establish the new household, but in practice, dowries were about much more than just practical support. They were tools of social maneuvering, political bargaining, and financial survival. For noble families, dowries could be massive. A daughter of a wealthy lord might arrive at her wedding with acres of land, ornate chests of silver, fine tapestries, and even castles promised to her husband. Her marriage might elevate the social standing of her entire family, linking them to powerful allies. On the other end of the spectrum, peasant families still had to provide something, maybe a cow, some chickens, or a small parcel of farmland. Even the poorest families felt the pressure, and sometimes fathers went into debt just to secure a marriage for their daughter. The transaction, therefore, was as much about family reputation as it was about the bride herself. Here's where things got awkward. Weddings were often public, and the exchange of the dowry was no exception. The groom or his family might openly inspect the goods, counting coins, checking livestock, or examining jewelry to ensure it was genuine. Imagine a bride standing in her wedding gown while her husband's relatives poke and prod through her belongings, weighing silverware or appraising fabrics. It was less like a wedding ceremony and more like a marketplace deal. Some records even tell us of disputes erupting at weddings over the dowry. If the groom's family felt cheated, or if the bride's family delivered less than promised, tensions could spill into arguments, sometimes in front of the entire gathering. There are stories of grooms refusing to continue the ceremony until the dowry issue was settled, leaving brides humiliated at the altar. Far from being a symbol of unity, the dowry often highlighted the transactional nature of marriage, stripping it of its romance. The awkwardness went deeper still. In some cultures, a dowry wasn't just about wealth. It was also tied to a bride's virtue. A larger dowry might be required for an older bride, as if her value diminished with age. Widows who remarried often brought less, and brides who were rumored to lack chastity sometimes found their families forced to sweeten the deal with extra gifts. The dowry system, in effect, put a literal price on a woman's body and reputation. But dowries weren't just humiliating for brides. They could also burden grooms. Once received, a dowry had to be managed carefully. If squandered or misused, the groom's family risked legal disputes with the bride's relatives. In some places, if the husband died, the dowry, or at least a portion of it, was supposed to return to the bride to support her as a widow. This meant dowries were more than just gifts. They were binding contracts that could be enforced in court. Marriage, therefore, was not only a personal union, but also a web of legal and financial obligations. Of course, not everyone viewed dowries as grim. For many brides, a dowry was their ticket to a better life. A wealthy dowry could help a woman marry into a higher social class, elevating her status and giving her children brighter futures. Families sometimes scrimped and saved for years, sacrificing their own comfort just to secure a marriage that would lift their daughter above her station. Yet even in these cases, the dowry remained a reminder that marriage was as much about strategy as it was about affection. Some dowry traditions also turned downright absurd. In Italy, wealthy merchant families competed to offer the grandest dowries, leading to an arms race of extravagance. Rival families would try to outdo one another by showering brides with gold, jewels, and entire estates. In Florence, the dowry system became so expensive that many fathers simply couldn't afford to marry off their daughters. Some young women ended up in convents, not because they wanted to, but because their families couldn't pay the price of marriage. For poorer families, the opposite problem existed. Unable to provide a substantial dowry, some daughters married later in life, or not at all. In rare but tragic cases, girls were abandoned or left unmarried because their families couldn't afford to provide for them. The dowry system, then, was both a blessing and a curse, opening doors for some while closing them for others. The awkwardness of dowry negotiations lingered throughout medieval Europe, and while the practice eventually faded in many places, its effects echoed for centuries. Even in later periods, marriage retained its transactional elements, with wealth and property often outweighing love. When we look back at medieval weddings, the dowry serves as a striking reminder of how different their priorities were from ours, and how awkwardly those priorities played out in the midst of ceremonies that, in theory, were supposed to be joyous. Picture the scene again. The bride in her gown, her father nervously presenting gifts, the groom's family scrutinizing the offerings, and the murmurs of guests watching it all unfold. For the bride and groom, it may have been one of the most important days of their lives. But for everyone else, it was often little more than a business transaction on full display. And so, while today's weddings focus on vows, kisses, and dancing, medieval weddings often revolved around dowries, wealth, and transactions. Rituals that were awkward, public, and far from romantic, yet utterly essential in the world of the Middle Ages. Section 4. Strange Superstitions and Wedding Charms. When we imagine weddings, we often think of traditions like tossing the bouquet, exchanging rings, or wearing something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. These customs feel lighthearted, even whimsical. But if we step back into the medieval world, we enter a realm where wedding superstitions carried far greater weight. In a society deeply shaped by faith, folklore, and fear of the unknown, people believed that unseen forces, spirits, demons, curses, and blessings could make or break a marriage. And so wedding days were surrounded by a host of charms and rituals, many of them surprisingly awkward, strange, and fascinating. For starters, medieval people were convinced that weddings attracted evil spirits. The joining of two souls was seen as a powerful moment, one that both heaven and hell might take an interest in. Because of this, brides were often wrapped in layers of charms and symbols meant to keep malevolent forces away. For example, a bride might carry herbs such as rosemary, sage, or dill, not just for their pleasant scent, but because they were thought to ward off demons and bad luck. Garlic, too, sometimes made its way into bridal garlands, more as a shield against the supernatural than as a culinary garnish. The awkwardness here is easy to imagine. A beautifully dressed bride, smelling faintly of garlic, standing proudly before her guests, who knew the odor meant she was fending off evil. Clothing itself was steeped in superstition. In many regions, brides wore the color blue, a symbol of purity and fidelity, long before the modern white wedding dress became popular. Some wore charms sewn into the hem of their gown, tiny bells, iron nails, or even scraps of animal bone to confuse or frighten spirits. Shoes also played a role in medieval superstitions. In England, it was common for wedding guests to throw old shoes at the bride and groom, a gesture meant to bring luck. In some cases, brides actually wore one of their father's old shoes during the ceremony, a symbolic and slightly awkward way of showing that ownership had passed from father to husband. Another peculiar custom was the belief in crossing thresholds. It was considered unlucky for a bride to trip while entering her new home after the wedding. To avoid this, grooms often carried brides over the threshold. While we think of this as a sweet romantic gesture today, its origins were rooted in superstition and fear. People believed that evil spirits lurked at the doorway, ready to sneak inside if the bride stumbled. Carrying her ensured both her safety and the purity of the household. Superstitions didn't just stop with the bride and groom, they extended to the timing of the wedding itself. Choosing the right day was seen as crucial. Fridays were unlucky, as were certain saints' feast days. Marriages held during Lent were frowned upon, while others believed in the luck of specific months. "Marry in May, rue the day," went one saying, while June was thought to bring prosperity and fertility. The result was that medieval calendars were carefully consulted, and couples often waited for astrologers or priests to declare the most auspicious time. Some even timed their vows according to the position of the stars, a merging of Christianity and older pagan beliefs that coexisted uneasily. Food, too, played its part in wedding charms. Before the ceremony, it was common to share symbolic foods believed to bring fertility and happiness. For instance, cakes made of wheat and honey were broken over the bride's head, the crumbs collected by guests for good luck. In Scotland, oat cakes were sometimes crumbled over the heads of the couple, while in France, guests smashed sweet confections near the bridal bed. This led to another awkward situation. Weddings often involved a symbolic invasion of privacy, where family members followed the bride and groom to their bedchamber, carrying foods, candles, and charms to ensure a fruitful union. There were also protective chants and incantations. Some regions believed that whispering specific prayers into the bride's ear while she stood at the altar could shield her from envy or curses. In parts of Germany, guests tied ribbons or herbs to the couple's bedposts to secure fertility. In Scandinavia, grooms sometimes wore swords to the ceremony, not for style, but to ward off malicious spirits lurking nearby. Perhaps one of the most unusual customs was the use of animal parts as charms. In some regions, carrying a hare's foot was believed to bring fertility, while placing a piece of wolf fur under the marriage bed would supposedly guard the couple from infidelity. These practices, blending superstition with folklore, reveal a society deeply preoccupied with protecting marriage from forces beyond human control. What makes these superstitions especially interesting is how awkwardly they mixed with the solemnity of the Church. The Christian Church encouraged blessings, prayers, and rituals within its framework, but people clung to older, folk practices as well. The result was weddings that looked both sacred and oddly folkloric. Imagine a bride standing at the altar, surrounded by candles, hymns, and prayers, while hidden in her bouquet are sprigs of garlic and iron nails. For the guests, this blend of holy and superstitious likely seemed natural. For us, it feels bizarrely contradictory, even humorous. At the heart of all these customs was a shared fear that marriage was vulnerable. Life in the Middle Ages was unpredictable, fragile, and often harsh. Plagues, famines, wars, and high mortality rates meant that stability was rare. A wedding, the foundation of family and lineage, was too important to leave unprotected. So people turned to charms, prayers, and superstitions to give them a sense of control in a world they couldn't fully master. And yet, these traditions also added layers of meaning to the wedding day. They transformed the ceremony into something more than a legal or religious union. It became a spiritual and cosmic battle against unseen forces. Whether it was smashing cakes, throwing shoes, or sewing bells into dresses, each act symbolized hope, fear, and the human desire for safety and happiness. So, when we look at medieval weddings through the lens of superstition, we see more than quaint customs. We glimpse the anxieties and beliefs of a world where people lived close to nature, religion, and the unknown. Their charms may seem strange or awkward to us, but to them, they were essential. In their eyes, no marriage was complete without the blessings of both heaven and the protection of charms strong enough to keep misfortune at bay. Section 5. Feasts, excess, and awkward celebrations. If there was one thing medieval weddings were famous for, it was the feast. In a world where food could often be scarce and simple meals were the daily norm, a wedding was an opportunity for abundance, celebration, and sheer indulgence. Yet, behind the merriment, there was also a certain awkwardness. The feasts were not just about eating and drinking. They were highly ritualized social performances, full of hidden meanings, curious customs, and sometimes embarrassing spectacles that reflected the values of medieval society. At the heart of these celebrations was the notion of hospitality. A wedding was not considered truly successful unless the couple and their families offered more food and drink than the guests could possibly consume. In fact, it was common for families to go into debt to fund an impressive banquet, as the quality of the feast reflected the honor and status of both families. Imagine the pressure. A family of modest means might slaughter their only cow or buy expensive imported spices, not because they could afford it, but because a poor wedding feast would be remembered and mocked for years to come. The menus themselves were staggering in both variety and extravagance. A typical noble wedding might feature roasted swans, peacocks redressed in their own feathers, whole roasted boars, and pies stuffed with songbirds that would fly out when the crust was cut open, delighting or startling the guests. Fish, too, was important, especially in Catholic regions where religious fasting rules influenced wedding meals. For the wealthy, rare delicacies like sugar sculptures, gilded pastries, and spiced wines were presented, not only as food, but as symbols of wealth and sophistication. Guests were expected to marvel at the dishes as much as they were expected to eat them. For peasants, wedding feasts were far simpler, but no less significant. These gatherings might include hearty stews, bread, cheese, and ale, with perhaps a pig or sheep roasted for the occasion. The food might not have been exotic, but the sheer quantity was what made it remarkable. For many peasants, a wedding provided a rare chance to eat until they were truly full, something daily life did not always allow. The awkwardness lay in the sheer imbalance. Nobles displayed extravagance to emphasize power, while peasants struggled to scrape together enough for a celebration that still had to impress their neighbors. The feasts were not simply about food. They were performances of social hierarchy. Guests were seated according to rank, with the highest-ranking individuals placed closest to the couple, and the lowest further away. The couple themselves often sat on a raised platform, in full view of everyone, so that they became part of the spectacle. This elevated seating was symbolic of their new union, but also left them under constant observation, as every smile, every gesture, and even every bite was scrutinized. One particularly awkward tradition involved the public sharing of the bridal cup. This large, elaborately decorated vessel was filled with spiced wine or ale and passed around for everyone to drink. Symbolizing unity and community, it was a noble idea, but in practice, hundreds of people sipping from the same cup could not have been the most hygienic or graceful experience. For the bride, who was expected to drink first, the act symbolized her role as the center of the event. But one can imagine the discomfort of sipping politely, knowing the cup would soon make its way around the entire hall. Alcohol played a major role in wedding feasts, and with it came both merriment and disorder. Ale, mead, and wine flowed freely, often leading to rowdy behavior. Drunken singing, crude jokes, and even brawls were not unheard of. In fact, some wedding feasts became so disorderly that local authorities occasionally had to intervene. Yet this chaos was also expected. It was part of the celebratory release. After all, weddings were one of the few moments when ordinary rules of conduct loosened, and laughter, even at someone's expense, was welcomed. Entertainment added another layer of awkwardness to the feast. Minstrels, jugglers, and jesters performed for the guests, telling stories or singing bawdy songs. Some entertainers poked fun at the newlyweds themselves, drawing laughter from the crowd, but sometimes causing embarrassment. In more elaborate weddings, entire pageants or mock battles were staged in the hall, blurring the line between feast and theater. Guests were both participants and audience, drawn into a spectacle that could be as overwhelming as it was joyous. One of the most curious traditions tied to wedding feasts was the bedding ceremony, which sometimes began in the banquet hall itself. After hours of feasting, guests would escort the couple to their bedchamber with loud music, laughter, and chants. In some regions, the bedding was entirely symbolic. In others, it was taken disturbingly literally, with family members or friends present until the couple lay in bed. To us, the idea of such public intrusion into a private moment seems shockingly awkward. But in the medieval mindset, fertility was the purpose of marriage, and ensuring the union was sealed carried social and even economic weight. Cakes also made their appearance in medieval feasts, though not in the form we recognize today. Instead of sweet, fluffy confections, medieval wedding cakes were often dense, bread-like loaves or spiced buns stacked in a tower. Guests would try to kiss the bride and groom over the pile without knocking it over, a tradition that combined awkward physical comedy with symbolic fertility, as successfully balancing the cake was believed to foretell a stable marriage. Later, this evolved into the more refined sugar confections we associate with weddings today. But the origins were far messier and more comical. Beyond the spectacle, these feasts carried deep symbolic meaning. To feast together was to bind families, communities, and social groups. The abundance of food and drink symbolized hope for prosperity, while the shared rituals of eating and drinking reinforced bonds of loyalty and unity. Yet the awkwardness, the forced smiles, the chaotic drunkenness, the symbolic intrusions, reminds us that medieval weddings were as much about social duty as personal joy. From our perspective, the feasts might seem over the top, even absurd, but to medieval people, they were vital markers of honor, fertility, and community. A wedding without a feast was unthinkable, just as a feast without its awkward rituals would have felt incomplete. And so, medieval couples entered married life under the watchful eyes of their guests, surrounded by laughter, abundance, and the strange, fascinating customs that turned a simple meal into a moment of history. Section 6. Gifts, Dowries, and Awkward Exchanges. If the feast symbolized abundance and community, then the giving and receiving of gifts at medieval weddings revealed the deeper, often awkward negotiations of wealth, status, and obligation. Weddings were never just about love. They were economic transactions as much as spiritual unions. The exchange of goods, whether in the form of a dowry, a bride price, or lavish presents, carried enormous symbolic weight, and sometimes created situations that must have been deeply uncomfortable for those involved. The dowry system was at the center of this ritual economy. A dowry was the property, wealth, or goods that the bride's family provided to the groom and his household upon marriage. It was not a mere gift, but rather a form of security, ensuring that the bride would be cared for and increasing the status of her new household. Dowries could include anything from land and livestock to clothing, jewelry, and even servants. In some noble families, the sums were staggering. Castles, villages, or vast tracts of farmland might change hands with the marriage. Yet for all its practicality, the dowry also carried awkwardness. For poorer families, scraping together a dowry could be a crippling burden, sometimes leading to years of debt. A daughter without a dowry was often seen as unmarriageable. And some families even sent daughters to convents simply because they could not afford to marry them off. Imagine the humiliation of arriving at a wedding with meager goods to present, knowing that every guest, every relative, and every rival was silently comparing your offering to others. Weddings, in this sense, were stages for financial performance as much as for personal celebration. In some cultures of medieval Europe, the dowry was balanced or replaced by a bride price, in which the groom's family gave gifts or money to the brides. This practice symbolized the value of the bride's fertility and labor as she was leaving her natal family to join another household. While it may sound flattering, in practice it was another reminder that marriages were as much about property and productivity as about affection. For the bride, this could feel objectifying. Her worth was measured not in her character or desires, but in cows, coins, or cloaks. Gifts extended beyond these large economic transactions. Guests themselves were expected to bring offerings to the newlyweds, which could range from practical household goods to more symbolic gestures. Linen, blankets, and kitchenware were common gifts for peasant couples, while nobles might present silver goblets, tapestries, or fine garments. But the giving of gifts also reinforced hierarchy. A lord might bestow a generous present on his vassal's marriage as a display of power, while a poor guest might feel the sting of shame at arriving empty-handed or with a humble loaf of bread. Some of these customs carried rituals that, by our modern standards, seem almost comically awkward. In parts of medieval France and Germany, It was traditional for guests to shower the bride with grain or coins, meant to symbolize fertility and prosperity. While the intention was noble, the reality was far less graceful. Showers of grain in the hair, coins pelting against dresses, and the bride forced to stand smiling as she was pelted from all sides. A cheerful blessing could quickly turn into something resembling a test of endurance. Even more unusual was the practice in some regions of parading the dowry through the streets before the wedding. Imagine chests of linens, bundles of clothing, and perhaps even livestock being marched in a long procession for everyone to see. This display served two purposes. It proved that the bride's family had fulfilled their obligations, and it allowed the community to judge the wealth, or lack thereof, being brought into the union. For the bride and her family, it must have been both a proud and nerve-wracking moment, standing exposed to the whispers and judgments of neighbors. Noble families, of course, elevated gift-giving into an art form. Jewel-encrusted belts, golden brooches, or finely embroidered garments were exchanged not only between the couple, but between entire families. These gifts were not just tokens of goodwill, they were political statements. To gift a piece of land or an ornate relic was to forge an alliance, to bind two lineages together. And yet the grandeur could also feel hollow. Behind the glittering objects were negotiations, bargains, and sometimes grudges. A poorly chosen or insufficiently lavish gift could spark gossip or even resentment. There were also symbolic gifts tied specifically to fertility. In some regions, brides were presented with girdles, garlands, or even herbs believed to enhance childbearing. Guests might give apples, nuts, or eggs as tokens of fertility, each loaded with meaning. These gifts, while intended to bless, could place enormous pressure on the bride, as they were constant reminders that her primary role in the marriage was to produce children. For a young woman facing her wedding day, such gestures may have felt less like blessings and more like heavy expectations. It's worth remembering that gifts were not always material. Songs, poems, and blessings were often performed or written as wedding offerings, especially among communities that valued oral traditions. These gifts carried warmth and sincerity, but they too were performances, with the audience keenly aware of the skill or lack thereof of the giver. An awkwardly sung ballad or poorly rhymed verse might elicit polite smiles, but become a private joke for years to come. What stands out in all these customs is the constant tension between generosity and obligation. A gift was never just a gift. It carried meaning, expectation, and social weight. To give too little was to insult. To give too much was to outshine. And to give inappropriately was to embarrass. Weddings, in this way, were arenas of delicate balance, where the art of gift-giving revealed the true currents of wealth, pride, and status beneath the surface of celebration. From the awkward showers of grain to the paraded dowries and glittering jewels, these exchanges remind us that medieval weddings were about far more than personal joy. They were about families proving themselves, communities reinforcing hierarchies, and individuals navigating the uncomfortable space between generosity and obligation. Section 7. Music, Dance, and Awkward Entertainment. No medieval wedding was complete without music and dance. If the feast filled bellies and the gift-giving filled obligations, then the music and performances filled the air, creating an atmosphere that was at once joyous, chaotic, and often deeply awkward. To imagine these scenes is to imagine the Middle Ages not as a silent world of stone halls and stern faces, but as one alive with sound. Lutes strumming, pipes whistling, tambourines rattling, and voices raised in song. Yet, just like every other element of the wedding, the music and entertainment came with its own peculiar traditions, hidden tensions, and moments of embarrassment that remind us just how human these gatherings really were. Musicians were a fixture at noble weddings, and often even at humbler ones. Professional minstrels, troubadours, or wandering players were hired to perform, bringing songs of love, chivalry, and devotion. Their melodies floated through great halls, echoing off stone walls, creating a sense of grandeur. But not all songs were refined ballads. Many wedding tunes were downright bawdy, full of playful innuendo and cheeky humor. These were meant to encourage laughter, loosen inhibitions, and remind everyone that marriage was as much about physical union as it was about spiritual vows. For a shy bride and groom, however, being serenaded with songs that left little to the imagination might have been more mortifying than merry. Dance, too, played a central role in the celebrations. Noble guests might perform stately processional dances, moving in carefully choreographed steps that displayed grace and discipline. For the lower classes, however, dancing was a more exuberant, even wild affair. Village weddings often erupted into lively reels, circle dances, and stomping jigs. These dances blurred the lines of order, pulling guests together in close physical contact. Imagine the awkwardness for strangers, rivals, or reluctant in-laws suddenly linked hand in hand, forced to spin, sway, and stumble together to the relentless rhythm of drums and fiddles. In some regions, the bridal dance was itself a peculiar custom. Guests would line up to dance with the bride in exchange for coins or gifts, often placing money in her shoe or stocking as they spun her around the floor. What began as a symbolic way of contributing to the couple's household could become a tiring ordeal for the bride, who was expected to smile and dance with dozens, sometimes hundreds of guests. The poor groom, meanwhile, often stood to the side, watching as his new wife twirled in the arms of other men, waiting his turn at the very end. Music and dance were not the only forms of entertainment. Medieval weddings often included performances by jesters, acrobats, fire eaters, and animal trainers. These spectacles delighted guests but could easily slip into the absurd. A jester's jokes might cross into inappropriate territory, leaving red faces in their wake. Acrobats might attempt stunts in the narrow, smoky confines of a hall, only to knock over goblets or tumble into the feast. In some cases, trained bears or monkeys were brought in to amuse the crowd. The laughter was genuine, but so too was the underlying awkwardness. Was this dignified celebration or a chaotic carnival? The content of these performances often reflected fertility themes, much like the bawdy songs. Entertainers might mime suggestive scenes or perform ribald plays that parodied marriage itself. To modern ears, these performances sound less like wedding entertainment and more like pranks, but they reflected the medieval understanding that humor and fertility went hand in hand. Still, one can imagine the discomfort of a new bride, perhaps only a teenager, being subjected to endless jokes and skits about the duties awaiting her on her wedding night. There was also a communal aspect to entertainment that could be as awkward as it was joyful, the expectation that guests themselves would contribute. Music making was not just for professionals. Guests were often called upon to sing, recite poems, or tell stories. For some, this was a chance to shine, to display wit or skill before an audience. For others, it was a nightmare of public embarrassment, a voice cracking in song, a poem stumbling on its rhymes, or a tale that dragged on too long. All could become the subject of whispered mockery. Weddings were, in this sense, talent shows where not everyone was suited to perform. It's easy to forget, too, that medieval instruments were not tuned with modern precision. Pipes might squeak, drums might boom off-beat, and lutes could break strings mid-song. Combined with crowded halls, drunken guests, and noisy children, the atmosphere was less like a serene concert and more like a cacophony. For all their reputation of elegance, many medieval weddings must have sounded like joyful chaos, music clashing with laughter, dancing feet stomping on floorboards, and the occasional shout as someone tripped or a plate shattered mid-song. At times, the entertainment even verged on dangerous. Fire-breathing performers risked setting decorations aflame, while energetic dancers could injure themselves on rough floors. Yet these dangers were part of the thrill. Weddings were one of the few times when communities gathered en masse for revelry, and excess, whether in food, drink, or entertainment, was not just tolerated, but expected. If things became a little too wild, well, that only added to the memory. And yet, beneath the noise and awkwardness, there was a deeper purpose to all this merriment. Music and dance were not simply distractions, they were forms of bonding. In dancing together, in singing familiar songs, in laughing at silly plays, the community reaffirmed itself. The awkwardness of holding hands with a stranger, or laughing at a crude joke, was part of the experience. It reminded everyone that marriage was not just a private bond, but a communal one. So when we imagine medieval weddings, we should not picture solemn, silent ceremonies, but riotous celebrations where joy, embarrassment, and chaos mingled freely. From the bawdy songs to the awkward dances, from jesters' jokes to the clashing notes of a minstrel's lute. These moments of entertainment remind us that weddings were about shared humanity as much as ritual. In the noise, the laughter, and even the embarrassment, the bonds of community were forged just as firmly as those between bride and groom. Section 8. Rituals of Bedding and the Awkward Public Night. Of all the awkward medieval wedding traditions, perhaps none was more uncomfortable than the rituals surrounding the bedding. To modern sensibilities, the idea of an intimate night being in any way public feels shocking, even invasive. Yet in the Middle Ages, the union of bride and groom was not just a private matter. It was a social contract, a legal arrangement, and above all, a moment of immense communal importance. This meant that what followed the feast did not simply vanish behind closed doors. Instead, it often unfolded as a curious blend of ritual, celebration, embarrassment, and spectacle. The bedding ceremony began with the community escorting the couple to their chamber. This could be done with great pomp and pageantry, the guests singing ribald songs and carrying candles or torches to light the way. Some records describe the couple being paraded through the hall, still dressed in their wedding finery, while guests shouted jokes and bawdy encouragements. The intention was twofold: to honor the couple and to remind them, in no uncertain terms, of the expectations awaiting them. Once inside the chamber, things could take on a more ritualized form. In noble households, bedding the bride and groom was often witnessed by high-ranking members of the family or even clergy. The couple might be ceremonially undressed by attendants, women helping the bride, men assisting the groom, while prayers or blessings were recited. In some cases, Holy water was sprinkled on the bed to purify it, underscoring that this act, however intimate, was still seen as part of God's design. For the couple themselves, however, the experience must have been intensely awkward. To have one's wedding night turned into a semi-public performance, watched or overseen by family elders and priests. Among the lower classes, the bedding ceremony was more raucous and less restrained. Friends might play practical jokes, tying knots in the sheets, hiding objects in the bed, or even tossing the couple into bed fully clothed. Drunken guests might linger in the chamber, singing and jeering, long after the couple wished to be left alone. Some traditions included mock tests of the couple's readiness. Jokes about whether the groom was strong enough for the night ahead, or whether the bride was prepared to earn her keep. For a nervous young couple, especially those entering arranged marriages, this must have been deeply mortifying. One of the most unusual aspects of the bedding tradition was the symbolic importance placed on consummation. Marriage was not considered fully binding until it had been physically sealed, and in some regions, evidence of this was expected. Stories abound, though their accuracy is debated, of bedsheets being displayed the following morning to prove the bride's virginity had been lost. Whether this was common practice or more of a sensational tale, the very idea reveals the degree to which private intimacy was treated as communal business. The couple's personal bond was, in effect, the concern of the entire community. Yet for all its awkwardness, the bedding ceremony also carried a sense of celebration. In many places, once the couple was finally left alone, the guests continued to revel outside, singing, dancing, or holding torches aloft. The night of the wedding was as much for the community as for the bride and groom, a moment when the entire village or household felt it had played its part in ushering in the new union. The embarrassment of the rituals, the teasing songs, even the pranks, were seen as expressions of goodwill, however uncomfortable they may have been to endure. There were also symbolic layers to these customs. Escorting the couple to bed represented the passing of responsibility, from parents to spouse, from maidenhood or bachelorhood to married life. The prayers and blessings over the bed reflected the hope that this union would bring children, ensuring the continuation of family lines and the stability of society. Even the bawdy jokes served a purpose: to break the tension, to acknowledge the awkwardness, and to transform anxiety into laughter. Still, one cannot help but imagine the emotional turmoil of those involved. A young bride, perhaps only in her teens, might have been terrified at the prospect of marriage, let alone the public rituals surrounding the bedding. A groom, pressured to perform, might have felt equal parts pride and dread, and for families, the need to turn something so intimate into a communal ritual must have been fraught with contradictions, deeply personal, yet necessarily public. Over time, the formality of the bedding ceremony faded. By the late Middle Ages, it had become more symbolic, with fewer witnesses and less direct involvement. Yet echoes of it remain in later traditions, from the carrying of the bride over the threshold to the playful honeymoon games in some European villages. These are gentler reminders of a time when the wedding night was not just the couple's business, but a moment of spectacle, expectation, and, above all, awkwardness. Looking back, the bedding traditions of the medieval wedding might strike us as crude, even cruel. but they were rooted in a world where marriage was not simply about love or companionship. It was about alliances, families, and the continuation of society itself. In that context, it made sense for the community to watch over, and even intrude upon, the couple's first night together. The discomfort, the embarrassment, and the awkward laughter were part of a larger tapestry that bound not only two individuals, but two families, and often entire communities. So while today we might cherish privacy, the medieval couple had no such luxury. Their wedding night was as public as the feast or the ceremony, a strange mixture of solemn ritual and raucous entertainment. And in that mingling of reverence and ridicule, of blessings and bawdy jokes, we glimpse the heart of medieval weddings themselves, a world where the personal and the communal could never be fully separated. Section 9. The morning after and strange post-wedding customs. If the wedding day itself was filled with spectacle, laughter, and awkward rituals, then the morning after was no less peculiar in the medieval world. The night had been a test of union, of intimacy, of the couple's first steps together. But in many cultures across medieval Europe, the dawn brought with it a new round of customs, observations, and even scrutiny. While today we may picture the newlyweds waking in quiet privacy, centuries ago their first morning as husband and wife was anything but private. One of the most striking traditions involved the infamous morning after inspection. In some regions, particularly in noble and royal households, attendants or family members were said to examine the bed linens for evidence of consummation. This could mean looking for traces of blood, which were believed to prove the bride's virginity had been lost, and thereby validate the marriage contract. While the frequency and universality of this practice is debated by historians, its mere mention in sources suggests that it was a real enough expectation to weigh heavily on newlyweds. Imagine the pressure, the first intimate act of one's married life being subject to literal proof, a form of public accountability for something deeply personal. In villages and towns, the morning after was often less solemn, but no less intrusive. Guests who had drunk and feasted the night before might gather outside the chamber door, waiting for the couple to emerge. Songs would be sung, sometimes teasing, sometimes congratulatory, welcoming the pair into the daylight as husband and wife. In some cases, mischievous friends might burst into the room, pulling practical jokes, or even dragging the sleepy couple out of bed to continue the celebrations. While it may sound cruel today, it was often seen as a gesture of camaraderie, a playful reminder that the marriage was a communal affair rather than a private one. A curious tradition in certain parts of Europe involved the presentation of food and drink to the newlyweds the following morning. Dishes believed to inspire fertility, such as eggs, nuts, or honey, were offered to the couple, sometimes in bed. Ale or spiced wine might be poured to revive them after the night's exertions, both feasting and otherwise. These foods carried symbolic meaning: sweetness for harmony, abundance for prosperity, and fertility for the hope of children. In this way, the morning meal was not just about nourishment, but about blessing the couple's future together. Among the nobility, the morning after could also carry significant political weight. Marriages were often alliances between powerful families, and the union's consummation was a matter of dynastic importance. Courtiers, envoys, or clerics might be informed, sometimes even officially, that the marriage had been successfully completed. In some royal cases, proclamations were made or records kept, ensuring that no one could later contest the validity of the match. The idea that a couple's first night together could be part of statecraft is a striking reminder of how public and political medieval marriage truly was. Another awkward tradition was the Sharaviri, a noisy celebration or mock serenade performed outside the couple's window the morning after. Pots and pans were clanged, horns were blown, and raucous songs were shouted, all in the name of congratulating or teasing the newlyweds. While this custom varied widely across regions, its purpose was the same: to ensure that the marriage was publicly acknowledged, with no chance for secrecy or retreat. For the couple, it could be both embarrassing and oddly reassuring, a sign that their union had the full attention of the community. Not all morning-after customs were loud or intrusive. Some carried a more symbolic gentleness. In certain regions, friends or family might place flowers or greenery outside the couple's chamber as a sign of fertility and blessing. In parts of Scandinavia, symbolic gifts were left at the foot of the bed: bread for abundance, salt for preservation, or a candle for light in the household. These simple gestures reflected a quieter hope for the marriage, that it would be fruitful, enduring, and filled with warmth. There was also the tradition of the bridal mass. On the morning after the wedding, the couple might attend a special church service together, presenting themselves before God and the community as a newly united pair. Still dressed in elements of their wedding clothes, they walked side by side to the altar, receiving blessings that sanctified not only their union, but also the life they were about to build together. For many couples, this moment may have been more meaningful than the feasts and rituals. It was a chance to begin their marriage with solemnity and faith. And yet, awkwardness lingered in every corner of the morning-after traditions. Newlyweds, especially young brides and grooms in arranged marriages, might have still been strangers to one another. To wake after such a night, watched, teased, blessed, and scrutinized, must have felt overwhelming. For some, the rituals may have been joyful, a sign of communal support. For others, they must have been painfully embarrassing, a reminder that privacy was a rare luxury in medieval life. Over time, many of these customs faded. The morning after inspections became less common, and the Sharaviri, while it survived in some rural places for centuries, lost its prominence. But their legacy remains. Modern traditions such as the honeymoon breakfast, or even the light-hearted teasing of newlyweds by friends, echo faintly of a time when the first morning of marriage was not simply personal, but something to be shared with an entire community. In the end, the morning after was a continuation of the same paradox that defined medieval weddings: intensely private, yet undeniably public. What should have been a moment of rest and reflection was instead transformed into a social stage, with the couple at its center. And while today we might recoil at the lack of boundaries, it is worth remembering that for medieval society, the collective mattered as much as the individual. Marriage was not only about two people, it was about families, communities, and the very fabric of society. So as the morning sun filtered through the shutters of the bridal chamber, the medieval couple awoke not just to one another, but to a world watching, waiting, and ready to judge or to celebrate. Section 10. Unusual Gifts and Dowry Customs. When we imagine a wedding today, we often picture wrapped gifts, handwritten cards, and perhaps a toaster or set of linens presented to the happy couple. But in the Middle Ages, the gifts exchanged during and after weddings were far stranger, sometimes lavish, sometimes awkward, and always deeply symbolic. To truly understand the eccentricities of medieval weddings, one has to step into the world of dowries, dower rites, and peculiar offerings that often said more about wealth, politics, and social standing than about love. The most important gift of all was the dowry, and in many ways, it was less a gift than a carefully calculated contract. A dowry was property, land, livestock, or wealth that the bride's family gave to the groom or his family as part of the marriage arrangement. In noble households, this could mean entire estates or castles, effectively transferring great swathes of land as part of a union. For common folk, the dowry might consist of a cow, a few pieces of clothing, or a small sum of money. But regardless of scale, the principle was the same. The bride came with assets, meant to support her new household and ensure her economic security. For noble families, the dowry was a matter of strategy. A princess married off to a foreign king might bring with her gold, jewels, or tapestries, all designed to enhance her new husband's prestige. Some marriages were arranged, not because of personal affection, but because the bride's dowry promised an invaluable advantage. Whether military alliances, political leverage, or economic gain. The awkward part, however, was how transactional it all felt. In many cases, the bride herself was seen less as a person and more as a vessel for wealth and alliance. Imagine being a young woman, leaving your family home, knowing that your marriage had been purchased and your dowry would dictate your worth. The groom, in turn, had his own obligation. He often promised what was called a dower, a portion of his property set aside for his wife should he die. This was meant to ensure her security as a widow. For a bride's family, negotiating the size and nature of this dower was as important as presenting the dowry itself. The result was often a complex web of promises, oaths, and written contracts, overseen by witnesses to ensure fairness. Still, fairness was a relative term. While noble brides might be left with entire estates, peasant women often relied on much smaller, humbler arrangements, like a patch of farmland, or a few tools to sustain them in widowhood. But alongside these formal transactions came a world of peculiar wedding gifts, some of which might leave us smiling or raising our eyebrows today. In rural villages, neighbors might present the couple with livestock, chickens, goats, or even pigs. These animals weren't simply food. They were the foundation of survival, ensuring that the new household could sustain itself. While practical, it might have been a bit embarrassing to have your wedding celebrated with the bleating of a goat in your new home. Among wealthier families, gifts could be extravagant and symbolic. Tapestries embroidered with elaborate scenes, silver goblets, and finely crafted furniture were popular. Jewelry was another common gift, but even here, the meanings could be curious. Rings set with unusual stones were thought to carry protective or magical properties, ensuring fertility or warding off evil spirits. A necklace of amber beads, for example, might have been prized not only for its beauty, but also for its supposed power to protect the wearer from misfortune. Perhaps the strangest gifts were those rooted in superstition. In some regions, a bride might be given a loaf of bread baked with odd ingredients, herbs, seeds, or even symbolic objects hidden inside, meant to ensure prosperity. In Germany and parts of Scandinavia, brides were sometimes presented with charms or talismans, designed to protect their fertility and guard against curses or infertility. One story tells of brides being given belts inscribed with protective prayers to be worn under their clothing as a safeguard against misfortune. These gifts, though well-meaning, blurred the line between practical support and mystical insurance policies. The symbolism extended to what might seem humble gifts today. Salt, for instance, was enormously valuable in the Middle Ages and could be given as a sign of preservation and stability. Honey was offered for sweetness and harmony, while grain or seeds represented abundance. In a society so deeply tied to agriculture and survival, these gestures carried great weight, even if they might appear simple to us now. In royal weddings, the gifts could be downright surreal. Exotic animals, rare manuscripts, and even entire villages were sometimes offered as part of a bride's dowry or as gifts from the groom. One record tells of a medieval queen receiving a crown adorned not only with jewels, but also with a piece of a holy relic, an item believed to carry divine protection. To present such a gift was both a statement of devotion and a declaration of power, showing that the marriage was blessed not only by men, but by God Himself. Yet for all their grandeur, these customs could also be awkward, even humiliating. A bride might find herself publicly appraised, her dowry inspected and discussed as though it were merchandise. Guests might gossip about whether her dowry was generous enough, or whether the groom's promises were sufficient to secure her future. For young women, particularly those from less wealthy families, this scrutiny must have been deeply uncomfortable. Their lives and futures were being weighed against livestock, land, or silver coins. Still, there was a softer side to these customs. Beyond the contracts and negotiations, family members and friends often gave smaller, more personal gifts. Hand-sewn linens, wooden spoons carved with care, or tokens of affection meant to remind the couple of home. These modest offerings may not have matched the grandeur of castles or estates, but they carried with them the warmth of genuine love and support, something that in the end mattered far more than the size of a dowry. When we reflect on medieval dowries and wedding gifts, we see a picture both strange and human. On the one hand, marriages were transactional, laden with politics, wealth, and strategy. On the other, they were tender, filled with gestures of hope, superstition, and care. For every noble bride who carried a chest of gold into her new home, there was a peasant bride clutching a simple hen or loaf of bread, both equally precious in their worlds. And perhaps that is what makes these customs so fascinating. They reveal the priorities of the time, where survival and security mattered as much as love, and where gifts, whether goats, jewels, or charms, carried layers of meaning that went far beyond their physical form. Section 11. Feasting, Drinking, and Strange Wedding Foods. One of the most memorable parts of a medieval wedding was the feast. Unlike today's gatherings where meals are often familiar and comfortable, medieval wedding feasts were elaborate, unusual, and sometimes even a little bizarre by modern standards. They were carefully planned events, meant to display wealth, impress guests, and celebrate the joining of families. But they were also full of strange flavors, curious textures, and surprising ingredients that might make a modern diner raise an eyebrow. The day's celebrations typically began with a banquet, often held in a great hall or outdoors if the weather permitted. Long tables were arranged with benches, and guests were seated according to status, with the bride and groom at the center, elevated on a dais or platform. The air would be thick with the aroma of roasting meats, fresh bread, herbs, and spices, some imported from faraway lands. Cinnamon, saffron, and ginger were used to flavor dishes, offering a hint of luxury and exoticism. Even the humblest village feast could include pies or pastries spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg, ingredients that were rare and highly prized. Roasted meats were the centerpiece of most feasts. Chickens, geese, pigs, and sometimes deer or boar were served, often accompanied by rich sauces. In noble households, the presentation was part of the spectacle. Whole animals might be carved at the table, with garnishes arranged in intricate patterns. For the common folk, the menu was simpler, but no less hearty. Roasted fowl, pies filled with meat and vegetables, and perhaps a small ale or mead to wash it down. The goal was abundance. Guests should leave the table sated, their stomachs full, and their eyes impressed by the generosity of the hosts. One particularly strange dish that sometimes appeared at medieval weddings was the subtleties or entremets. These were edible displays, sometimes in the shape of animals, castles, or even human figures, crafted from sugar, marzipan, or pastry. They were less about taste and more about spectacle and storytelling. A baker might craft a marzipan lion to symbolize strength, or a sugar castle to honor a noble family's status. Guests would admire these creations, sometimes nibbling on them, while marveling at the skill required to produce such delicate, ephemeral art. Fish was also common at wedding feasts, especially for guests who observed religious dietary restrictions. Salmon, trout, and herring were popular, often preserved with salt or smoked. Some feasts featured elaborate fish pies, baked with layers of pastry, herbs, and sometimes even sweet fillings like dried fruit. These dishes reflected the medieval palate, which favored a combination of sweet and savory flavors in ways that may seem unusual today. Honey, raisins, and spices could be mixed into meat pies, creating a taste profile that was complex, rich, and distinctly medieval. Bread, of course, played a central role. It was not only a staple, but also a symbol. Large, round loaves might be placed on the table, sometimes decorated with patterns, initials, or symbols meaningful to the couple. Guests would break bread together, a gesture symbolizing community, shared life, and prosperity. In some regions, the bride and groom would perform a ritual with the bread, cutting it together, offering pieces to each other, or sharing it with their parents, representing the unity of two families and the hope for a bountiful household. Drinks were equally important. Ale and mead were common for the common folk, while wine was favored by the nobility. In some parts of Europe, spiced wine was served, often heated and sweetened with honey. Guests might sip from large goblets or shared cups, passing them from hand to hand. Toasting the couple was a regular feature, with songs and blessings accompanying each round. In some cultures, the first toast might involve a ceremonial drink from a shared cup, a symbolic act of unity and mutual commitment. Desserts, while less elaborate than today, could also be surprising. Sweetened pastries, almond cakes, and sugared fruits were popular among the wealthier classes. Some desserts were intentionally designed to amuse or challenge guests, like marzipan figures or cakes filled with hidden objects. Coins, rings, or other small items might be baked into cakes, offering lucky finds to guests who discovered them. This playful element added a sense of fun, turning dessert into a small adventure and creating memories that would last long after the feast had ended. Interestingly, food at medieval weddings was not always just about pleasure. Some dishes carried symbolic meaning. Beans, lentils, and grains were included to ensure fertility and prosperity. Nuts symbolized abundance, while honey represented sweetness in married life. Even the way food was presented could carry meaning. Pies and pastries might be layered to reflect the union of two families, or arranged in patterns representing protection and blessing. Despite all the spectacle, some customs were awkward or even gross by modern standards. For instance, guests might share communal dishes, dipping bread into sauces or soups, sometimes with minimal concern for hygiene. Certain meats or fish might be left unrefrigerated for some time, relying on salt or smoke to preserve them. In rural weddings, animals might still be alive during the feast, adding a layer of chaos or surprise to the proceedings. For the couple, experiencing all of this, the sights, smells, and textures would have been overwhelming, yet unforgettable. By the end of the wedding feast, the couple and their guests had shared a communal experience of abundance, celebration, and strange culinary delights. These feasts were not just about food, they were a social performance, a reflection of wealth, status, and cultural values. Each dish told a story, each drink carried a blessing, and each morsel reflected centuries of tradition, superstition, and artistry. Even today, when we think of medieval weddings, we often imagine them as strange or extravagant. But understanding the feasts and foods offers insight into the world they lived in. A world where abundance was celebrated, symbolism mattered, and meals were as much about spectacle as they were about nourishment. And so, the couple left the table, full, joyful, and perhaps a little bewildered, ready to continue their life together, carrying with them the memories and flavors of one of the most unusual mornings they would ever experience. Section 12. The Wedding Night. Private and Public Customs. After the wedding feast, when the guests had returned home or retired to quiet corners, the newlyweds faced one of the most anticipated moments of the day, the wedding night. In the Middle Ages, this was a time shrouded in both ritual and superstition, blending private intimacy with public expectation. While today we might think of the wedding night as a private affair, medieval customs often involved a delicate interplay between what was private and what was known to the community. The night usually began with the couple being escorted to their chamber, often with friends or family members walking them to ensure safety and proper ritual. In noble households, the bridal chamber would be prepared with great care, luxurious linens, scented herbs, and sometimes even special talismans designed to protect the couple from harm or misfortune. The beds were often adorned with embroidery, candles, and fragrant oils. These touches were not simply for comfort, they were meant to symbolize prosperity, fertility, and protection. One particularly curious tradition involved displaying the marriage bed to witnesses. In some regions, a few trusted friends or relatives might briefly inspect the bed to ensure it was properly prepared. This practice seems strange to us now, but in medieval society, where lineage, inheritance, and legitimacy were central, it served a purpose. It demonstrated that the couple was ready to fulfill their marital duties, particularly the expectation of producing children. The night itself was surrounded by superstitions and rituals. For example, in certain areas, candles would be placed in specific positions to bring luck or ward off evil spirits. Herbs like rosemary, lavender, or rue might be scattered around the room or hung above the bed to protect the couple from curses, disease, or infertility. Even the color of the bed linens could carry meaning. White was often chosen for purity and protection, while red might symbolize vitality or fertility. These customs reveal the deep intertwining of practical concern and mystical belief in medieval life. Before the couple retired fully to private moments, some households observed preliminary rituals, such as games or symbolic gestures. A bride might be lifted over the threshold of the new home, a tradition meant to protect her from tripping or evil spirits. Sometimes, small symbolic gifts or charms were placed near the bed, like a sprig of rosemary for remembrance or a coin for prosperity. Even the act of locking the door could be ceremonial, indicating the beginning of a new, secure life together. For the bride and groom themselves, there was often a mix of excitement and nervousness. In many cases, the couple had only just met, or perhaps had spent very little time together, depending on whether the marriage was arranged. The wedding night was not only about consummating the marriage, but also about beginning a partnership under the scrutiny of social expectations. This created a complex emotional landscape, combining joy, anxiety, and the weight of duty. Curiously, some communities had publicized aspects of the wedding night as well. In certain cultures, it was customary for friends or neighbors to inquire the next day whether the marriage had been consummated. This may seem intrusive today, but in medieval society, it was closely tied to ensuring legitimacy of heirs and confirming that marriage contracts were properly fulfilled. Gossip about the wedding night, though private by our standards, was an accepted form of social observation and control. The role of midwives or household matrons was also significant. In some traditions, older women would provide guidance, instructions, or even practical assistance to the newlyweds. They might advise on positions, timing, or rituals designed to ensure fertility. While this could feel invasive, it was framed as a duty of care, a way to support the continuation of family lineage. The presence of such guidance illustrates the interconnection of personal life and community responsibility in the medieval period. Food and drink sometimes accompanied the rituals of the wedding night. A small sweet cake, honey, or wine might be offered to the couple to encourage vitality and health. The symbolism of sweetness and abundance was applied not only to the feast earlier, but also to the intimate moments that followed, linking nourishment with blessing and fertility. Even the act of sharing a small drink could be imbued with the hope for prosperity and a harmonious life together. The environment itself played a role in creating comfort and auspiciousness. Curtains or canopies around the bed helped preserve privacy and warmth, while incense or herbs filled the room with calming aromas. These touches, combined with ritualistic symbols and charms, transformed the bedroom into a space that was at once intimate, protective, and meaningful. The couple's senses would have been engaged on many levels: sight, smell, touch, and even hearing, as the flicker of candlelight cast gentle shadows across the room. Despite all the preparation, not every wedding night went smoothly. Illness, nerves, and the pressure of expectation sometimes made the evening awkward or challenging. Yet these difficulties were often softened by the communal rituals surrounding the couple, the advice from experienced matrons, the protective charms, and the symbolic gestures embedded in the environment. Every element, from candles to cakes, worked together to create a sense of security, support, and calm. Ultimately, the medieval wedding night was more than an intimate encounter. It was a carefully orchestrated beginning of life together, deeply embedded in social custom, superstition, and ritual. It combined the personal and the communal, the practical and the mystical, creating a space where two lives intersected under layers of expectation, tradition, and hope. Even today, when we read about these customs, it is striking how much thought, care, and symbolism were woven into each moment. The wedding night was not simply a private affair, it was a reflection of a society that saw marriage as a complex intersection of love, duty, and social order. The intimacy, the superstition, and the gentle rituals all work together to ease the couple into their new life, connecting the practical with the mystical and the personal with the communal. Section 13. Music, dancing, and wedding entertainment. After the rituals and private moments of the wedding night, the celebrations often return to a more public and festive atmosphere. Music and dancing were central to medieval weddings, creating a joyful, rhythmic energy that balanced the solemnity and ritual of the day. These performances were carefully chosen, sometimes by professional musicians, sometimes by family members or local villagers, and they provided both entertainment and symbolic meaning. In noble households, musicians were often hired to play a variety of instruments. Lutes, harps, flutes, and drums filled the air with harmonious melodies. Trumpets or horns might announce the arrival of guests or mark the start of specific ceremonies. The soundscape of a medieval wedding was rich and layered, blending gentle melodies with lively rhythms that encouraged dancing and movement. Even simple folk weddings included music, often with homemade instruments like tambourines, simple flutes, or stringed instruments crafted by local artisans. Dancing itself varied widely depending on region, status, and local custom. Noble weddings might feature formal dances, choreographed to display grace and elegance, while peasants enjoyed more spontaneous, energetic dances with lively steps and intricate footwork. Circle dances, partner dances, and group formations were common, and each movement carried meaning, symbolizing unity, joy, and the balance of the community. Guests often joined in, creating a sense of togetherness, where young and old could participate in the celebration. Some dances were accompanied by singing, either by professional minstrels or by guests themselves. Songs might recount the virtues of the bride and groom, tell stories of famous couples, or carry wishes for fertility and prosperity. Lyrics often included humor, gentle teasing, or references to local traditions. The combination of music, song, and dance created an immersive experience, one that engaged all the senses and drew guests into the celebration fully. In addition to music and dance, other forms of entertainment were woven into the wedding day. Storytelling was popular, especially tales of romance, heroism, or moral lessons. Jesters or performers might entertain with physical comedy, clever wordplay, or subtle satire. Animal performances, such as trained birds or small pets performing tricks, were sometimes included, especially in noble settings where spectacle was valued. Each element of entertainment was designed to delight, amuse, and sometimes even instruct guests, blending pleasure with subtle social messaging. Feasting often continued alongside music and dancing. Guests might enjoy small snacks, sweet treats, or spiced drinks as they participated in the entertainment. The interplay between food, music, and movement created a continuous rhythm for the day. Feasting provided nourishment, music engaged the senses, and dancing allowed physical release and joy. The atmosphere was one of sustained celebration, where each activity flowed naturally into the next, creating a seamless tapestry of experience. Certain rituals or symbolic acts were integrated into the entertainment. For example, in some regions, guests might toss coins or small gifts to the couple during dances, symbolizing prosperity and good fortune. Others included playful competitions, such as mock battles, games of skill, or friendly contests of wit and humor. These activities encouraged participation, reinforced social bonds, and allowed guests to contribute to the couple's joy in meaningful ways. Interestingly, not all wedding entertainment was spontaneous or improvised. In noble households, a wedding planner of sorts, often a trusted servant or family member, would orchestrate the entire sequence of events, ensuring that music, dancing, food, and ritual occurred in proper order. Timing was important. Some dances or songs were reserved for specific moments, such as the arrival of the bride, the cutting of a ceremonial cake, or the final blessing at the close of the feast. The careful choreography reflected the value placed on structure, ceremony. These activities encouraged participation, reinforced social bonds, and allowed guests to contribute to the couple's joy in meaningful ways, and symbolism in medieval society. Children sometimes participated as well, either by performing simple dances, singing, or carrying small symbolic items during processions. Their presence added an element of innocence and continuity, reminding all guests of the cycles of life, family, and community. Even their simple actions carried meaning, connecting the joyful present with hopes for future generations. Decorations like banners, flowers, and greenery often complemented the music and dancing. Their movement in the flickering light of torches or candles added visual rhythm, enhancing the sensory richness of the day. Colors, patterns, and symbols were chosen carefully, reflecting the couple's family heraldry, local traditions, or wishes for happiness and fertility. These details, combined with music and movement, created an immersive environment where every sense was engaged, yet in a gentle, calming rhythm. By the end of the evening, guests would be tired but fulfilled, carrying with them memories of melody, laughter, and playful energy. Music and dancing had provided both entertainment and symbolic blessing, celebrating the union of two individuals while reinforcing the cohesion of the wider community. The rhythms of the day, from quiet ritual to lively performance, mirrored the rhythms of life itself, where joy, care, and tradition intertwined. Even centuries later, reading about these celebrations offers insight into medieval life. Weddings were not simply private ceremonies. They were communal experiences, blending artistry, ritual, and social connection. Music and dance provided not just amusement, but also a sense of continuity, grounding personal joy within the broader tapestry of society. In every note played, every step danced, and every song sung, there was a reflection of human hopes, wishes, and the gentle beauty of shared celebration. Section 14: Clothing, Fashion, and Symbolic Dress at Weddings. Clothing played an essential role in medieval weddings, both for the bride and groom and for the attending guests. The garments chosen were not only practical and beautiful, but also symbolic, reflecting status, family connections, and cultural traditions. Every layer, color, and accessory carried meaning, transforming the visual appearance of the wedding into a rich tapestry of social and personal significance. For the bride, the gown was perhaps the most important element of the day. Contrary to modern assumptions, brides did not always wear white. The colors varied depending on region, wealth, and local customs. Deep reds, blues, and greens were common among nobility, while more muted or natural shades were often worn by peasants. Fabrics could range from luxurious silk or velvet to simpler wool or linen. Embroidery, sometimes gilded with gold thread, added intricate patterns, often incorporating symbols of prosperity, fertility, and protection. Veils were another essential component of bridal attire. They were not merely decorative, but carried multiple meanings. A veil could symbolize modesty and virtue, while its length and decoration indicated the social standing of the bride's family. In some areas, a long, flowing veil was believed to protect the bride from evil spirits or the envious eyes of onlookers. The careful arrangement of the veil, and sometimes the use of delicate floral crowns or ribbons, made the bride the visual center of attention, a living symbol of family hopes and communal joy. The groom's attire was equally significant. Nobles often wore tunics of fine fabric, adorned with embroidery, belts, and sometimes jewelry. Colors could be chosen to complement the bride's gown or to reflect family heraldry. In some traditions, the groom would wear specific shoes, hats, or cloaks that conveyed social rank or conveyed symbolic messages such as readiness for partnership, protection of the household, or authority within the community. Even small details, like the knot of a belt or the color of a sash, could carry meaning. Guests also contributed to the visual display of the wedding. Families carefully chose garments that would signify respect, status, and allegiance. Brightly colored tunics, embroidered dresses, and carefully tied head coverings created a vibrant, dynamic environment. The interplay of colors, textures, and patterns made the gathering a living painting, with movement and interaction bringing the scene to life. This visual harmony reinforced communal cohesion and offered a backdrop against which the bride and groom could shine. Accessories were another layer of significance. Rings, brooches, belts, and shoes were often chosen with care. Some families passed down heirlooms, imbuing the wedding attire with generational meaning. Others commissioned new pieces specifically for the occasion, embedding symbols of fertility, prosperity, or protection. Even gloves or small purses could carry symbolic weight, reminding all present of the interconnection between wealth, status, and tradition. Headwear was particularly important. Men might wear hats, caps, or circlets that reflected status, profession, or regional identity. Women's head coverings ranged from simple linen coifs to elaborately decorated headdresses adorned with ribbons, pearls, or flowers. The choice of headwear was often dictated by both fashion and cultural expectation, serving as a silent yet powerful signal of propriety, virtue, and familial standing. Jewelry added another layer of meaning. Necklaces, bracelets, and rings often incorporated precious metals, stones, or symbolic charms. In addition to aesthetic appeal, these pieces carry blessings, talismans, or family symbols meant to protect the couple or ensure a prosperous union. Even small details, such as a pin with a particular gemstone, could hold deep cultural or spiritual significance. In some regions, shoes were intentionally symbolic. Pointed toes, elaborate embroidery, or colored dyes were used to convey social standing or family allegiance. The careful arrangement of footwear was especially important in the rituals of the wedding procession or ceremonial dances. Shoes might even be exchanged as tokens between families, a gesture symbolizing union, cooperation, and continuity. Children and attendants also played a role in the visual presentation of the wedding. Pages and young girls might carry ribbons, flowers, or small banners, adding layers of movement and color. Their attire, often miniature versions of adult garments, reflected the broader symbolism of family continuity and societal order. The children's participation added a gentle, charming rhythm to the celebration, a reminder of life, growth, and future generations. Even small details, like embroidery patterns, the type of thread, or the placement of a ribbon, were imbued with meaning. Medieval weddings were not simply about fashion. They were a carefully curated combination of visual, symbolic, and social messages. Every garment told a story about the bride, the groom, their families, and the community as a whole. By the end of the day, the visual splendor of clothing, accessories, and adornments had created an immersive environment. Guests could see the intentions, values, and hopes of the families reflected in the vibrant display of colors, textures, and symbols. The combination of fashion and ritual allowed each wedding to become not only a personal celebration, but also a communal affirmation of social bonds, cultural traditions, and shared aspirations. In reading about these customs today, it is striking how much attention was paid to visual symbolism and social meaning. The clothing worn at medieval weddings was far more than decorative. It was a language, a story told through fabric, color, and detail. Every thread, stitch, and adornment carried history, hope, and cultural weight. In this way, medieval wedding attire was not just a matter of appearance, but an essential part of the ceremony, blending beauty, tradition, and meaning into every carefully chosen garment. Section 15. Gifts, Blessings, and Farewells. As the wedding celebration drew to a close, attention turned to gifts, blessings, and farewells. These final moments were often gentle, quiet, and reflective, offering a chance for the couple and their guests to pause, absorb the day's experiences, and prepare for the new life ahead. Gifts were carefully chosen, carrying both practical and symbolic meaning. They were not merely objects, but tokens of love, support, and communal goodwill, designed to provide for the couple and remind them of their place within the larger family and community. In noble households, gifts could range from precious metals, jewelry, and fine fabrics to elaborate household items such as silverware, carved furniture, or tapestries. Each gift was selected not only for its value, but for the intention behind it. A piece of jewelry might symbolize protection or fidelity, while a tapestry could represent the weaving together of two families. Even seemingly simple gifts, such as a basket of spices or a carefully crafted container of oils, carried layers of meaning. Among common folk, gifts were often more practical. Tools for the household, cooking vessels, or handmade linens were given to support the couple in their daily life. Sometimes the gifts were edible. Grains, cured meats, or honey could provide sustenance for the first months of married life. Each offering, simple or lavish, reflected thoughtfulness and care, emphasizing the communal nature of marriage and the interdependence of neighbors, friends, and family. Blessings accompanied these gifts. Elders often spoke words of guidance, hope, and wisdom, wishing the couple happiness, prosperity, and resilience. These blessings might be spoken quietly, whispered in the couple's ears, or recited aloud to the assembly. In some traditions, blessings included symbolic actions, such as touching the couple's shoulders, sprinkling water, or presenting tokens that represented fertility, protection, or longevity. The combination of words and ritual created a sense of continuity, connecting the couple to generations past and to the wider community around them. Children often played a role in these final moments, carrying small gifts or tokens, such as flowers, ribbons, or tiny coins. Their presence reminded everyone of the cycles of life, the future, and the continuity of family and community. Young participants added gentle energy and movement to the farewell, balancing the solemnity of blessings with moments of playfulness and charm. Farewells were marked by careful attention to etiquette and ritual. Guests departed gradually, sometimes accompanied by soft music or singing. The couple might bow or curtsy, acknowledging each guest personally. In noble households, the departure of each guest could be a structured procession, with attendants guiding visitors from one room to another, ensuring that no one was overlooked. Among common folk, farewells were simpler, but equally meaningful, often accompanied by shared laughter, conversation, and well wishes. Sometimes, gifts and blessings were accompanied by small ceremonies or symbolic gestures. A candle might be lit to represent hope and guidance for the couple's life together. A piece of bread could be broken to symbolize unity and sharing. These small acts, though quiet and unobtrusive, carried deep meaning, leaving lasting impressions of connection, care, and intention. In addition to tangible gifts, stories and advice were often shared. Elders recounted examples of successful marriages, lessons learned, or humorous anecdotes, gently reminding the couple of the joys and challenges that lay ahead. Such stories were a calming presence, offering reassurance and guidance without pressure, helping the couple feel grounded and supported as they moved forward into married life. The departure of guests was usually accompanied by subtle rhythms, from the soft rustle of fabric to the quiet footsteps along corridors or streets. These final sounds provided closure to the day's events, a gentle cadence marking the transition from celebration to reflection. As the couple retreated into their private quarters, the lingering music, the scent of flowers, and the memories of laughter created a calm, warm atmosphere, a soft ending to a day of ritual, joy, and communal celebration. By the end of the wedding, the couple was surrounded by the traces of the day, gifts that symbolized care and support, blessings that offered guidance and protection, and memories of music, dance, and shared celebration. Each moment of farewell reflected the care of family, friends, and community, reminding the couple that their union was not only personal, but part of a wider social tapestry. The conclusion of the day was gentle, slow, and thoughtful, allowing space for reflection and quiet joy. Even centuries later, the customs surrounding gifts, blessings, and farewells offer a window into the values of medieval society. Weddings were not merely private celebrations. They were communal experiences, rich in symbolism, care, and attention to detail. Each gift, each blessing, each gesture was a thread in the larger fabric of social and familial life, weaving meaning and connection into the union of two individuals. As the night fell and the last guests departed, the couple was left with the quiet comfort of shared love, communal support, and the soft rhythm of tradition. Candles flickered, music faded, and the household slowly returned to calm. The gentle echoes of the day remained, a lasting impression of care, celebration, and connection. In these quiet moments, the significance of every detail, every gift, every blessing, every farewell became clear, a reminder that weddings were, and always are, a celebration of life, love, and human connection. And now, as our journey through medieval weddings comes to a gentle close, you can imagine the soft flicker of candlelight, the lingering melodies of music, and the calm, warm presence of family and community. Let your mind rest on the rhythm of these celebrations, the gentle flow of ritual, dance, and blessing. The stories, the colors, and the soft laughter fade into memory, leaving behind the quiet joy of shared moments. May your thoughts drift slowly, peacefully, and calmly, as if walking down a sunlit medieval hall, surrounded by warmth and gentle smiles. Sleep well, and may your dreams carry the calm beauty of traditions, celebrations, and the quiet magic of centuries past.